A joint advisory dropped this week from the FBI, NSA, and Cyber National Mission Force, JCSA 2026-0826-01, naming a China-linked group called QTFY. Adrian, the headline number here isn't a 0 day, it's 2 million. That's how many scanning and exploitation tasks their platform processed in a single day back in 2024.
Right, and that's the bit that should actually worry people more than any individual CVE. QTFY isn't a hacking crew in the traditional sense, they're closer to a vendor. They've been operating since 2018 years, and what they've built is essentially a production scanning and exploitation service that other Chinese state-linked operators can plug into.
Welcome back to the Cyber Resilience Brief, a Safe Breach podcast. And this is our episode on QTFY. I'm your host, Tova Dvorin, and today, as usual, I am joined by our favorite offensive cybersecurity expert, Adrian Culley, to discuss this latest update about Chinese government-linked threat actors. Adrian, walk me through who QTFY actually are, because this advisory has a lot of Chinese company names in it.
And worth being precise here, rather than doing the alias soup thing, QTFY is attributed to a company named Nanjing Xinjiuwei. Practice saying that. You're going to hear a lot more about them in the next 5 or 6 years. Network technology. Nanjing Xinjiuwei network technology. Good news is XJW in intelligence speak for short. XJW sits in what the advisory calls the PRC, People's Republic of China, enabler ecosystem. Think of it as a layer of nominally private companies that do contract and subcontract work for the Ministry of State Security, but they are front companies. We've talked about this model before with iSoon.
Alias Soup, that's the name of our next cocktail, everyone. The iSoon link, that one read like a corporate sales deck for espionage, complete with pricing tables for stolen data.
That's the one, Tova, exactly. Same model, and this advisory confirms it's not a one-off. W has documented business relationships with 2 named Ministry of State Security units, 0718 and Unit 9086. There's a whole tier of vulnerability research and industrial security firms bidding on defence-adjacent contracts. Boji Security bid on power system vulnerability work at the National University of Defence Technology last June. Nanjing Lexbel won a contract to build data mining tools to support command and control system design. Fujian Ares won a finalist bid on at least 6 NUDT projects for radio frequency hardware and software. This isn't one shadow hacker group, it's a small industry with procurement cycles and named bidders, entirely Beijing government supported.
And QTFY personnel specifically, now I understand that they're Beijing government supported, but more specifically, who are they?
They're former People's Liberation Army, PLA members, according to the advisory, explicitly called out in the advisory, who've moved into this contracting ecosystem and also participate in freelance hacking networks, buying and selling exploits, buying and selling access to victim networks. They're plugged into what's called HW, or in Chinese, HVV. That's network attack and defense exercises against domestic critical national infrastructure. And here's the detail that actually tells you something. Their 0-day use against Ivanti Cloud Services appliance in September 24 happened directly after one of those exercises. The advisory's own inference is that these events function as a technique pipeline into groups like Q2F.
So domestic red teaming as a farm system for offensive capability.
That's a very fair read of it, yes. And the advisory adds one more line I'd like to flag, Tova. QTFY has been heavily researching and integrating AI into their processes over at least the last 2 years. No further detail given, but given everything else we've covered this year on AI-assisted operations, that's not a throwaway line. It's significant, and we're going to get a lot more detail in the future.
Well, for now, let's get into the tooling, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from an engineering standpoint. We have 3 named products.
QScan, QTRouter, and a set of IoT botnet platforms, and they're designed to work together as a pipeline. That's the important architectural point. QScan is the reconnaissance and exploitation engine. It's a distributed system built on RabbitMQ for task queuing and Redis for storing results. Genuinely standard infrastructure engineering choices, the kind you'd see in any large-scale commercial scraping operation. Worker nodes, mostly leased servers outside of China, pull scanning and exploitation jobs off the queue. It's got a database of over 200 proof-of-concept exploits written in Python, and it's built for volume. web page scraping, TLS certificate collection, subdomain enumeration, CMS plugin fingerprinting, and straight-up penetration testing at scale.
And we'll be right back.
For the listener who isn't running a SOC, what does build for volume actually mean in practice?
So it means QTFY isn't handpicking targets and carefully studying them the way a boutique APT crew might have operated in the past. They're running an industrial scanner against the entire internet continuously and letting the exploitation results tell them who's vulnerable today. Then when we have a new CVE drops, they can pivot that scanning infrastructure into it within days. That's exactly the pattern in the advisory's targeting timeline. Log4Shell in December 2021, proxy logon in March 2021, Avanti CSA 0 days in September 2024, FTP in April 2025, and as recently as February this year, Beyond Trust Remote Support, CVE 2026-1731, used against a US state government and water district.
That's the newest CEV in the advisory.
It is, and it's a great example and illustration of the model. End-day speed as the competitive advantage, not a 0-day arsenal as the primary weapon, though they clearly do use 0 days when they've got them. The September 2024 Ivanti campaign hit 3 Department of Energy labs, the National Institute of Health, the Health Resources and Services Administration, and a security device manufacturer, all off vulnerabilities that weren't public yet.
And then QTRouter is the obfuscation layer.
Right, and this is the part that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets in advisory coverage. QTRouter runs on compromised routers flashed with custom OpenWRT firmware, and it uses a legitimate open source tool called Clash to chain proxy connections together. What makes it effective isn't the code, it's the sourcing. QTRouter nodes include commercial residential proxy services, one specifically named Fastlink, Alibaba cloud infrastructure, and compromised consumer IoT devices, all mixed and blended together.
So when QTFY hits your network, the traffic isn't coming from an obvious Beijing IP block.
It's coming from a legitimate-looking residential IP, possibly in your own country, mixed in with genuine user traffic on a commercial proxy service. For a defender looking at logs, that doesn't read as an intrusion, it reads as a customer.
And behind that sits the botnet infrastructure.
At least 3 platforms, Tova: proxy platform management, proxy pool management system, and QT botnet. They aggregate compromised IoT devices, maintain a database of exploits and server fingerprints so that the whole system can rapidly weaponize new vulnerabilities against IoT gear specifically. And QT botnet's control server can launch DDoS attacks on command, view and import nodes, and run arbitrary commands on the compromised devices. It's a full-featured botnet sitting underneath a full-featured scanning platform, feeding a full-featured obfuscation network. 3 products, 1 supply chain.
Let's talk targeting. Who's actually getting hit?
So the sector list is broad, and it's the list you'd expect from a group doing volume scanning against critical infrastructure: defense industrial base, communications, energy, government, higher education, financial institutions, water utilities, healthcare. But there's a pattern in the 8-year timeline that's worth pulling out specifically because it's more revealing than the successful intrusions. Repeated unsuccessful scanning of things that aren't really espionage targets in the traditional sense. Selection systems in 2019, and again in June of this year. Children's Hospital in 2021. The US Senate alongside the hospital system in March. None of these scans succeeded, according to the advisory, but the persistence is the signal, not the failure.
And what does that persistence tell you?
So it tells me that the scanning is opportunistic and comprehensive, not narrowly targeted, and not deciding in advance we will attack the Senate, running the QScan against everything reachable on the internet. When something in the sensitive category lights up as a potentially vulnerable target, something more useful for defenders to understand than a story about deliberate targeting, because it means any internet-facing exposure puts you in scope, regardless of how interesting your organization thinks it is to a nation state on the threat level.
Now, the May 2024 campaign stands out in this advisory. There were over 300 organizations in one run. Can we talk a little about that?
That one used QScan, against a checkpoint quantum gateway vulnerability, CVE 2024-24919, US defense contractors, financial institutions, and universities all simultaneously. That's the volume model paying off in one line item. One exploit, one scanning run, hundreds of victims across sectors that have nothing in common except running the same vulnerable product on their perimeter.
So what should defenders actually be doing differently after reading this advisory?
A few concrete things, and none of them are exotic, which is almost the point, Tova. First, patch cadence on edge devices matters more than almost anything else here, because every single initial access event in this advisory is exploitation of a public-facing application. VPN gateways, file transfer appliances, CMS platforms, remote support tools. If it's internet-facing and it's been vulnerable for more than a few days after disclosure, QScan will find it. Secondly, audit what your internet-facing infrastructure is actually leaking. The advisory specifically calls out unintentional disclosure of API keys and configuration details to scanners and crawlers, which tells you QScan is harvesting more than just vulnerability status. It's harvesting operational secrets all along the way. Third, and this is the one I'd underline, don't treat the IP-based indicators in this advisory as a solved problem once you've blocked them. Given how QTRouter blends traffic Given how QTRouter blends traffic with legitimate residential and commercial proxy IPs, IOC blocklists alone will miss a meaningful share of this activity going forward. Behavioral detection sitting on top.
And from a validation standpoint, where does this fit into what a security team should actually be testing?
So the exploit list in the advisory is a gift, frankly, because it's very specific. 12 named CVEs across 8 years, from the Pulse Secure vulnerability in 2019 through to Beyond Trust this February. Any organization running an exposure validation program should be checking CVE by CVE whether their public-facing applications would actually stop these specific exploits, not just whether the category is generally covered by some off-the-shelf scanning rule. The gap that's easy to miss is the network side. QTRouter's proxy chaining isn't something a breach and attack simulation typically tests because it's not endpoint behavior. It's an obfuscation pattern in your network traffic. That's worth a separate conversation with whoever owns your egress and anomaly detection monitoring, specifically about whether traffic from residential IP ranges hitting sensitive applications would actually get flagged or just be waved through as normal.
So Adrian, what are you watching for next with this one?
Two things. Whether CVE 2026-7031, the Beyond Trust exploit, shows up against more than the 2 victims named so far, because that's a fresh NDA, and their pattern across 8 years is to run a newly weaponized exploit hard once they've got it working, the way they did with the checkpoint vulnerability against 300 organizations. Keep mentioning today, Tova, we're going to hear a lot more about these folks, and this is a huge part of the reason why. And whether we see QTRouters node sourcing shift, if they start relying more heavily on compromised IoT devices than commercial proxy services, that's usually a sign law enforcement or the proxy vendors themselves have started disrupting the commercial side of their infrastructure, and they're falling back to what they can fully control.
And we'll be right back.
So Adrian, before we close, one more question, because I think listeners will ask it. This advisory covers 8 years of activity. I repeat, 8 years. It's a long time, especially in the past 8 years. Why is it coming out now in this form rather than as a series of smaller alerts over that time?
Tova, there's a few likely reasons, though the advisory doesn't spell out its own timing. Bundling 8 years of infrastructure and targeting into one document like this usually means the investigative picture, the intelligence picture, only recently became complete enough to attribute confidently. And you're all fully aware, attribution in cyber operations is very, very difficult and really not for the faint-hearted. It's incredibly difficult to have high confidence. Connecting QTFY's tooling, the XJW corporate registration, and the MSS unit relationships takes sustained collection over time, not a single instant response engagement. And this has led to the move from TLP red status to public disclosure yesterday. It also tends to follow disruption or takedown activity elsewhere. You'll notice a lot of these domains have active status with no end date. That means the authoring agencies are still watching live infrastructure rather than describing something already dismantled. That's different from an advisory that drops after a takedown operation.
So this is a warning about something ongoing, not just a retrospective.
Exactly right, Tova, and it's worth listeners sitting with that. The domain qtteam.com is registered through 2032. Whoever's running this domain, this intelligence operation, Beijing, don't expect it to stop anytime soon.
And we'll be tracking it. Folks, that's QTFY, a China-linked group that's less than a hacking crew and more a scanning and exploitation business, running at industrial scale against a target list that includes just about everything with a public IP address. Adrian, thanks as always for providing us with perspective on this.
Thank you, Tova.
But until next time, stay safe with SafeBreach. The Cyber Resilience Brief is a SafeBreach podcast. Executive produced by Adrian Culley and Tova Dvorin. Music produced by Sar Dresner. Hosted, edited, and compiled on Riverside. For more about SafeBreach and how you can validate your security controls across your entire IT infrastructure, visit us at www.safebreach.com. That's www.safebeach.com.